I know this is a bit of a long story, but I really need to come forward with this. Perhaps this will save someone's life. Perhaps not. At least you can take this as a warning at the very minimum. A couple of months ago, I changed schools from one in New York City to one in western New York, more the woody areas. It turns out I couldn't live on campus as I changed schools too late into the year, so I ended up living in a small home belonging to a cousin who also studied in Europe. It was about 5 miles outside of campus. The only problem was that it was off any major roads, and it was in the middle of the woods. But I mean, I was in a safe community with neighbors 30 feet away and a watchman who patrolled the neighborhood who stayed up at night. For the first couple of weeks at my new school, nothing out of the ordinary happened. A lot of work was put on my shoulders, and I often spent my nights studying instead of sleeping, but nothing wrong happened. My neighbors seemed fine. I didn't have problems with anyone. Everything seemed normal. That is until the day I went home and found my house had been broken into. When I came into my driveway, I found my door kicked in, the door handle embedded in my wall, and what I can only describe as an oily black substance that looked something like thick motor oil running down my stairs. Naturally, I took out my phone and dialed 911, but when I got to the responder, the line dropped and my phone died, even though it had full battery. I ran up the stairs to go into the house, but as I put my feet on the top stair, I slipped and fell into the black substance. Some went in my mouth, God knows how. It tasted like a bitter couch syrup or some kind. Suddenly, I was in the living room of the house, even though I had no memory of getting up and going in, and I reached for the phone to call the police. As I dialed the number, I had this feeling of sleepiness that I had never felt before. It was almost like a wave came over me. I collapsed on the floor and passed out. But before I could close my eyes, I heard quick footsteps moving toward me and a shadow passing over me. A couple of hours later, I woke up with a feeling of desperation, depression. I looked around and saw that a laptop had been placed within arm's reach beside me. Strange, I thought, as I don't own a laptop. Examining the outside, I found the laptop had a red-like color to it, although there were patches of green and brown about it at odd places. It was smaller than any laptop I had ever seen, and there was no company logo on it or names on it like there usually was with a laptop. Perhaps the strangest detail of it was that there was bumps and indents, like it had been crushed or seriously broken in some way. I opened it, thinking that it wouldn't work, but to my surprise, it did, and it opened onto a video player like one that you would see in the full screen on YouTube. At first, I thought it was YouTube, but I couldn't find any button that would go to a smaller screen, and the only image I saw was a black screen with a white triangle in the middle. That was the play button. Summoning my courage, I pressed the button. The video began. It began with some words over a black screen. Narration.wmv. After about 5 seconds, they faded without a sound. Then there was a bright flash, and the screen faded into a child's face in close-up. She was about 8 or so, and had blonde curly hair, white skin, and blue eyes. She began to talk about 2 or 3 seconds, but the sound was distorted, and I could hardly make out words. After my ears got used to the distortion, I started
Dad,
picking out whatever the
Mate?
girl was saying.
Speak. Hear. Torture. Search.
After she spoke for about 30 seconds, the camera zoomed out,
Next.
and I saw the child in full view.
You.
She was sitting on the floor against a wall, completely naked. After a couple of seconds, a hand handed the child a razor blade. The child took it. She looked at it for a couple of moments and slowly began to smile. Then, in one fluid motion, she slit her wrists as a deafening scream came out of the speakers. As the blood poured out of her hands, she laughed and ran towards the camera, showing her bloody palms. As she reached the camera, the scream still continued. A montage of different images flashed quickly. Each one lasted for about 2 or 3 seconds and was beyond unsettling. The first was a horse lying on its side, a gun resting near it. Blood was streaming from its eyeballs, and its throat had been blasted open. The strangest part was that its teeth had been removed from its mouth and stabbed into the rest of its body. And the second image was of a man. He was lying on his back, his mouth open, and again, with his teeth pulled out of his mouth and stabbed into his body. His eyes had been rolled back into his skull, and his ears had wooden stakes through them. On his chest was written the words, "The narration is coming." And his legs, which had been removed from the torso, had been written on too. Narration. The third image was of a cat impaled into a wall by a steel pipe. Its teeth were removed again and stabbing into its body, and this time in a crucifixion-like pose. Its head was almost clean off its body, just being connected by a little bit of attached spine. The fourth and final image was of a shadow on a city street. In the left hand was a knife, dripping with what I assumed to be blood. And in its right hand was a shotgun with smoke coming out of it. On the ground, with a shadow over it, again, some writing. The words, "Here it is." The screaming got even louder at this point. But then the image faded to black. The image then faded to a city street. And the camera was now moving down it. A voice was speaking now. And I assumed this was the narration.
Have you thought about your pathetic life? Have you?
The voice boomed with laughter that made me sick to my stomach.
I bet you haven't. Standard people don't. You are one of them.
The camera stopped moving and stayed still, looking down the city street.
You made an error. A common, everyday error. You moved into my realm.
The camera began to slowly move out at this point.
All those images you saw, those were a few of my victims. The cat, the man, and the horse, they all came here in this part of New York for one reason or another. You came here. You came to this forest at this house. You moved here. You invaded my territory. And now I will attack.
The camera had turned 180 degrees and stopped. The face of the girl from earlier had appeared and she smiled.
You are next.
The girl collapsed into a pool of blood from her wrists.
And here is your script.
The voice laughed as the video ended. The video ended and closed itself. A Word document now took up the screen. It was a script of great length, talking about things like suffering and torture disgusted me, and as I looked up, I saw a woman. She was tall, nearly 6 feet tall, smiling. This horrible smile. I screamed as she walked out of the room. As she left, the black oil from before appeared on the floor in her footsteps. And like before, some was in my mouth. And I passed out. For the last 6 weeks, I haven't left the house. She stopped me from leaving every time I tried to, but by emptying my gas tank or killing the phones every time I use them. When I go to sleep, she appears at my bedside, smiling, saying that I need to practice for my last act. I really don't know what to do. So one night I went downstairs and got the laptop and opened the script. She smiled and said I was doing something right for once and that I had 2 weeks to prepare for my last act. Today is the last day in those 2 weeks. In a few minutes, she'll come in with her camera, go into the basement, and I'll sit against the wall and say my lines. And then she'll give me a razor blade. I'll look at it, and the cycle will continue. I don't know what to say or how to end this. Considering these are my final words to the world, I think that the only thing I should say is that if you ever come up to this part of New York, the woody, far away from civilization part of New York, do yourself a favor and get out of here. Otherwise, you might have to continue her narration.